This was your soulmate's last message to you. It will break your heart. Stay with me. Please don't rush this. I know the title sounds heavy, and it is, but not in the way you think. This isn't a message meant to wound you or pull you back into pain. It's a message meant to explain something your heart has been trying to understand for a long time. This is the kind of message that arrives when everything else has already been said in silence. This is not about drama. This is not about regret. This is about truth spoken too late to change the past, but just in time to free you. Your soulmate never planned to send this message. In fact, they resisted it for a long time. They told themselves it wasn't necessary. That silence was kinder. That moving forward without reopening anything was the responsible thing to do. They tried to convince themselves that you didn't need to hear what they never had the courage to say when it mattered most. But truth has a way of demanding space. This message comes from the quiet moments, the ones where distractions stop working. The late nights. The empty pauses. The moments when they finally stopped defending their choices and allowed themselves to feel what they buried. It comes from the part of them that knows something real was left unfinished, not because love was absent, but because fear was louder. If they were sitting across from you right now, they wouldn't speak quickly. They wouldn't know where to begin. Their voice would probably shake, not from emotion they don't understand, but from emotion they understand too well. Because this message isn't about asking for anything. It's about acknowledging something. They would tell you this first: you were never wrong. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't exaggerate the depth. You didn't feel too much. What you felt was real, and they knew it even when they pretended not to. That's the part that hurts the most for them to admit now. Because pretending cost them something they can never get back: honesty in the moment it mattered. They would tell you they saw it in the way you listened. In the way you didn't need explanations. In the way you understood their silences without trying to fix them. You made them feel safe enough to be seen and terrified enough to realize how much they were hiding from themselves. That's not something people forget. This message exists because they finally understand something they couldn't understand then. Choosing safety over truth doesn't erase truth, it just delays the reckoning. And the reckoning always comes. They would tell you that walking away from you was not relief. It was restraint. And restraint is exhausting. It looks like composure from the outside, but inside it feels like carrying a weight you never set down. They kept moving. They kept living. They kept doing what life required of them. But something stayed unfinished. That unfinished feeling followed them. It followed them into other conversations where depth felt forced. Into other connections where understanding felt shallow. Into moments of happiness that still felt incomplete. They don't say this to romanticize the past. They say it because it's the truth they owe you, and the truth they owe themselves. If this were truly their last message to you, they wouldn't ask you to come back. They wouldn't ask you to wait. They wouldn't ask you to understand them any more than you already have. They know now that asking that would be unfair. Instead, they would say this: I didn't lose you because I didn't care. I lost you because I wasn't brave enough to live honestly when honesty mattered. That sentence alone carries years of silence. They would tell you that loving you quietly was easier than choosing you openly. That keeping you in their heart without changing their life felt safer than risking everything for truth. And while that choice protected their stability, it cost them something deeper: integrity. They see that now. And here's the part that breaks their heart the most: they know that by the time they understood this, you had already grown beyond waiting. You learned to carry yourself differently. You learned not to beg for clarity. You learned that love without presence becomes pain. They noticed the change in you. You became quieter, but stronger. More distant, but clearer. Less available, but more grounded. That change told them everything they needed to know. It told them you were no longer living in hope, you were living in self-respect. And that's why this message doesn't come with expectations. It comes with acknowledgement. They would tell you they never forgot you. Not in the dramatic way people imagine, but in the subtle ways that matter most. In comparisons they didn't mean to make. In moments when they wished they could speak freely. In times when they realized that what you offered was rare, and rare things don't come back just because you're finally ready. This message is not meant to reopen wounds. It's meant to close a chapter cleanly. To say what silence never could. They would tell you they are sorry, not for loving you, but for not loving you out loud. For not choosing truth when it was inconvenient. For letting fear decide instead of courage. And then they would say the hardest part of all. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that what we shared mattered, and it mattered more than I let myself admit. That's it. No request. No promise. No attempt to rewrite the ending. Because this message isn't about changing the story. It's about honoring it. And here is the part meant for you, the part you may not realize yet. This message doesn't arrive to pull you backward. It arrives to release you fully. To confirm what you already knew in your bones. To let your heart rest knowing you didn't imagine the depth, and you didn't lose something because you weren't enough. You lost it because you were too real for someone who wasn't ready. That truth may hurt, but it also heals. Because now, there is nothing left unsaid. And when nothing is left unsaid, your heart is finally free to move forward without doubt, without wondering, without carrying someone else's unfinished truth. This wasn't the message that was meant to keep you. It was the message meant to let you go. And sometimes, that's the most honest love there is. Stay with me. I know this feels heavy already, and yet this part goes even deeper, not into pain, but into understanding. This is the part of the message your soulmate never knew how to say out loud, because saying it would have required them to face themselves in a way they weren't ready for at the time. This is not a message of hope or reunion. This is a message of reckoning, memory, and truth finally standing on its own feet. If they were still speaking, after admitting that they weren't brave enough, they would pause. Not because they don't know what to say next, but because they do. And knowing is harder than not knowing. They would take a breath and tell you that the hardest part was never losing you, it was realizing when they lost you. They didn't lose you the day you stopped talking. They didn't lose you the day distance grew. They didn't even lose you the day you walked away. They lost you the day they chose comfort over courage, and they knew it even then. That's the part they never admitted. In the moment, they dressed the choice up as responsibility, timing, realism, maturity. But deep down, they felt the split. They felt the fracture between what they wanted to feel and what they allowed themselves to act on. They would tell you that after you were gone, there were moments when life looked normal again. Friends, routines, responsibilities, laughter. From the outside, everything seemed to fall back into place. But inside, something stayed displaced. Like a room in their heart that no longer opened, but never closed either. They would tell you about the small moments you still showed up in. Not in obsession. Not in longing. But in recognition. They would hear a thought and think, you would understand this. They would feel something and realize, this is what I couldn't explain to you fast enough. They would sit in silence and know, this silence is not the same as the one I had with you. That's when the regret began. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Regret not for losing you, but for underestimating what you represented. They didn't realize at the time that you weren't just someone they loved in a complicated way. You were a mirror that reflected the most honest version of themselves. And when they walked away from you, they walked away from that version too. They tried to find it again. Not in you. Not by reaching out. But in other places. They tried to recreate the feeling of being seen without exposure, of being understood without defense. But nothing quite fit. Conversation stayed surface level. Connections required effort instead of ease. Even when something felt good, it didn't feel true in the same way. That's when the understanding sharpened into pain. They would tell you that loving you taught them something they didn't know before, that love isn't about intensity or permanence. It's about alignment. And alignment, once felt, becomes the standard by which everything else is measured. They would tell you they realized too late that you weren't asking for perfection. You weren't asking for guarantees. You weren't asking for the world to be rearranged overnight. You were asking for presence. For honesty. For the courage to say what was already true. And they didn't give you that. Not because they didn't care. But because caring exposed how unready they were. This is where their voice would soften even more. They would admit that they watched you change from a distance. Not in real time, not through updates or conversations, but through intuition. They felt the shift. The moment when your energy stopped leaning toward them. When your heart closed the door quietly instead of waiting in the doorway. That moment scared them more than losing you ever did. Because it meant you were no longer waiting for them to become something they weren't. It meant you had chosen yourself in a way that left no opening for excuses. And they knew then, really knew, that the version of you who might have stayed no longer existed. They would tell you that they sometimes wondered what would have happened if they had spoken sooner. If they had chosen truth when it was inconvenient instead of when it was too late. But those thoughts never stayed long, because they understood something else too. Wondering didn't change responsibility. Timing matters. Readiness matters. And they missed both. They would want you to know that this message is not an attempt to reclaim anything. They know better now. They know that the kind of growth you've done doesn't reverse. That the kind of clarity you carry now doesn't dissolve because someone finally found the words. They see you differently now, not as someone they lost, but as someone who outgrew the space they were offered. And that realization humbles them. They would tell you they learned from you how much damage silence can do when it replaces honesty. How restraint can look noble while quietly breaking trust. How love, when hidden, turns into something heavy instead of something shared. They would tell you they carry that lesson with them now. Into every conversation. Every relationship. Every moment where truth tries to rise and fear tries to stop it. They don't always get it right, but they are no longer unaware. You changed that. And here is the part they never expected to feel: gratitude. Not gratitude that you left, but gratitude that you didn't stay and shrink. Because if you had stayed, they might have never been forced to see themselves clearly. Your absence became the mirror they avoided while you were present. And that mirror changed them in ways they are still understanding. They would say, if they could find the right words, that you were not the love that failed. You were the love that revealed. And revelation is not always meant to be kept, it's meant to be carried forward. This is why this message feels final. Not because it's the end of caring, but because it's the end of illusion. The end of unspoken expectations. The end of wondering whether it was real. It was real. But real does not always mean meant to last. Sometimes real means meant to teach. Meant to wake you up. Meant to prepare you for a life that no longer tolerates half-truths or half-presence. And as this message fades, the part meant for you becomes clearer than ever. You were never abandoned. You were released. Released from waiting. Released from hoping someone else would grow fast enough. Released from carrying someone else's fear as your burden. This message doesn't ask you to remember them differently. It asks you to remember yourself, the version of you who felt deeply, loved honestly, and still had the strength to walk away when honesty wasn't returned. That version of you is not gone. That version of you is who you are now. And this is why this message, though it breaks the heart, also seals it. It closes the story without erasing it. It leaves no loose ends for your mind to loop through late at night. It lets your heart rest knowing that what you felt was true, and that truth was never your mistake. This was their last message because there is nothing left to say. And what comes next in your life will not arrive through silence or regret. It will arrive through clarity, presence, and a love that doesn't need to be explained after it's gone. Stay with me. This part is the quiet aftermath, the space after the message has been read, after the words have settled, after the ache has shifted from sharp to deep. This is the part that doesn't feel dramatic on the outside but changes everything on the inside. This is where your story finally begins to separate from theirs, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in truth. After their last message, there is silence again. But this silence is different. It doesn't feel like confusion. It doesn't feel like waiting. It doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like something has been placed down. Like a weight you didn't realize you were carrying has finally been set aside. You might notice it first in your body before your mind catches up. Your chest feels less tight. Your thoughts slow down. The endless mental conversations, the ones where you imagined what you would say if they ever admitted the truth, start to fade. Not because they no longer matter, but because they no longer need to happen. For a long time, your heart was holding two realities at once. One was what you lived. The other was what you sensed but never heard confirmed. That split is what kept you tired. That split is what kept you questioning yourself. And now, with their final message, those two realities have finally merged into one. You were right. Not in an ego-driven way. Not in a way that needs validation. But in the quiet, grounding way that lets your nervous system finally relax. You didn't imagine the depth. You didn't exaggerate the connection. You didn't ask for too much. You were responding to something real, and now you have confirmation without needing to chase it. But here's the truth most people don't talk about: confirmation doesn't bring you back to where you were. It moves you forward. You might have thought that hearing their truth would make you want them again, or pull you backward into longing. Instead, it does something else. It shows you how far you've already come. It reveals that the version of you who needed those words no longer exists in the same way. There was a time when this message would have shattered you. When it would have reopened every wound and made you want to run back, to fix things, to try again. But now, it lands differently. It still hurts. But it doesn't destabilize you. It hurts in a clean way. A way that doesn't confuse you about what you deserve. That's growth. You start to see the connection not as something that was taken from you, but as something that shaped you. You see how it taught you to trust your intuition. How it taught you the difference between love that is felt and love that is lived. How it showed you that emotional depth without emotional availability eventually becomes pain. And most importantly, you see how it taught you to choose yourself without hardening your heart. You may grieve now, not for them, but for the version of yourself who waited so long without answers. You may feel tenderness for the nights you spent replaying conversations, wondering if you were wrong to feel so deeply. That grief is not weakness. It's compassion finally being directed where it belongs. Toward you. This is where forgiveness quietly completes itself. Not forgiveness for them in a grand, moral sense, but forgiveness for yourself. For staying. For hoping. For loving without guarantees. You forgive yourself for not knowing then what you know now. And in that forgiveness, you stop punishing yourself with what ifs. You also begin to understand something else that changes how you carry this story. Their message was not an invitation. It was a release. They weren't asking you to return. They weren't asking you to wait. They weren't asking you to reopen anything. They were acknowledging a truth so you wouldn't have to keep carrying it alone. And that distinction matters. Because it means the responsibility is no longer shared. What they do with their awareness is theirs. What you do with your clarity is yours. And clarity is powerful. You may notice that you no longer feel pulled to check for signs, messages, or energy shifts. You no longer feel the urge to interpret silence. The bond that once felt magnetic now feels complete. Not gone, complete. It exists as part of your history, not as something tugging at your future. This is what people mean when they talk about closure, but rarely experience it fully. Closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something that happens when truth arrives and your heart is ready to receive it without bargaining. You're ready now. That readiness shows up in subtle ways. You're more present in your daily life. You laugh without the undercurrent of sadness. You imagine your future without automatically placing them in it. You feel open again, but not desperate. Your standards have changed, too. Not because you're guarded, but because you're clear. You no longer romanticize emotional unavailability. You no longer interpret mixed signals as depth. You no longer believe that love should hurt in order to be meaningful. And that clarity doesn't make you cynical. It makes you free. You also begin to understand that their inability to choose you openly was never about your worth. It was about their capacity. And capacity is not something love can force. It grows only when someone is willing to face themselves honestly. They are doing that now, but too late to ask you to wait. And that's okay. Because your life is not meant to pause while someone else learns how to be brave. There is a quiet strength in you now that wasn't there before. A steadiness. A sense of self that doesn't dissolve in the presence of deep emotion. You can feel fully without losing yourself. You can care without clinging. You can remember without reopening wounds. That's not indifference. That's integration. You've integrated the love, the loss, the lesson, and the growth into a single, grounded truth. You deserve a love that meets you in the open, not in hindsight. As this part of the story settles, you may feel something that surprises you: gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought. Not for the ending, but for the way it redirected you toward yourself. You can be grateful without wishing things had been different. Because if they had been different, you might not be who you are now. And who you are now is someone who knows their depth, honors their boundaries, and trusts their intuition without apology. That person is ready for something new. Not new in the sense of rushing forward, but new in the sense of alignment. A connection that doesn't need to be explained after it's gone. A love that doesn't arrive as a puzzle to solve, but as a presence to share. This part of the story doesn't end with a dramatic goodbye. It ends with a quiet turning inward. A moment where you realize that you are no longer defined by what didn't work out. You are defined by how deeply you can love and how clearly you can walk away when love isn't returned in the way you deserve. Their last message broke your heart. But it didn't break you. It did something far more important. It set you free. And from that freedom, your life begins to open in ways you don't need to predict or control. You trust that what comes next will meet you where you stand, whole, honest, and no longer waiting for someone else's courage. This chapter is complete. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it finished teaching you who you are. Stay with me. This part is not meant to be read quickly. It's meant to be sat with. This is the part where the emotional dust has settled enough for you to see the landscape clearly, not through pain, not through longing, but through understanding that feels steady and real. This is where the story stops echoing and starts integrating into who you are becoming. After the last message, something inside you changes its posture. You're no longer leaning toward the past, and you're not rushing toward the future either. You're standing in the present. Maybe for the first time in a long while, and that alone feels unfamiliar. For so long, part of you was living ahead of yourself, imagining conversations, answers, or endings that hadn't yet arrived. Now, those imagined futures lose their pull. Not because they were foolish, but because they're no longer needed. You begin to notice how quiet your mind has become. The loops that once ran automatically, the ones that asked why, how, and what if, start to slow down. You still remember everything, but the memories no longer demand your attention. They no longer feel like unfinished business. They feel like chapters you've already read and understood. This is the difference between remembering and reliving. And that difference matters. You start to see how much energy you were spending holding space for something unresolved. How much of your emotional bandwidth was dedicated to interpreting silences, managing hope, and staying open just in case. That way of being became so familiar that you didn't realize how heavy it was until it lifted. Now that it has, you can breathe differently. You may find yourself feeling lighter in unexpected moments. Laughing more easily. Feeling present in conversations without your mind drifting elsewhere. Enjoying small, ordinary things without the undercurrent of sadness that used to accompany them. These are not signs that you've forgotten what mattered. They're signs that you've reclaimed yourself. This part of the journey is subtle, but it's powerful. It's where you stop identifying as someone who was waiting for closure and start identifying as someone who has clarity. And clarity doesn't ask for permission to move forward. It doesn't need validation from the person who couldn't give you what you needed. Clarity stands on its own. You may also notice that your emotions have changed texture. You still feel deeply, that hasn't gone away, but your feelings are no longer overwhelming. They don't sweep you off your feet or pull you into extremes. Instead, they flow through you with a kind of calm intensity. You feel sadness without drowning in it. Gratitude without clinging. Compassion without self-sacrifice. This is emotional maturity taking root. And it didn't come from avoiding pain. It came from walking through it honestly. You begin to understand something about yourself that you couldn't see before. Your capacity to love was never the problem. Your openness, your depth, your willingness to connect, these were never flaws. They only became painful when they were met with hesitation instead of reciprocity. That realization changes how you see the past. You stop judging yourself for staying as long as you did. You stop replaying moments where you think you should have known better. You recognize that you acted from the best understanding you had at the time, an understanding rooted in hope, empathy, and sincerity. There is nothing to be ashamed of in that. If anything, it speaks to the quality of your heart. This is also where you stop romanticizing what could have been. Not because you're trying to minimize it, but because you can finally see it accurately. You see the beauty of the connection and its limitations at the same time. You see how real it was and why it couldn't sustain you. Holding both truths at once is what allows you to let go without bitterness. You don't need to rewrite the story to make it easier to release. You don't need to demonize them or idealize yourself. You don't need to pretend it didn't matter. It mattered. And it still wasn't enough. That's not a failure. That's information. As you sit with this understanding, you may feel a new kind of strength emerging, not the loud, performative kind, but a quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. You trust yourself now. You trust your ability to recognize alignment and misalignment. You trust that if something doesn't feel right, you don't need to wait for proof to step back. That trust is one of the greatest gifts this entire experience gave you. It means you will never again stay where love is implied but not lived. You will never again accept emotional breadcrumbs in place of presence. You will never again confuse depth with difficulty. These aren't rules you force yourself to follow. They're truths you live from. You might also notice that your boundaries feel different now. They're not rigid. They're not defensive. They're natural. You don't have to think about them constantly or explain them to others. You simply know what you're available for, and what you're not. And that clarity changes the kind of people who are drawn to you. You'll start to notice that those who thrive on ambiguity, mixed signals, or emotional dependence no longer feel appealing. Not because you judge them, but because your nervous system no longer recognizes that dynamic as home. Instead, you feel drawn to people who are present, grounded, and emotionally congruent. This shift may feel strange at first. After all, intensity used to feel like connection. Uncertainty used to feel like chemistry. Now, ease feels like alignment, and that can take some getting used to. But ease doesn't mean lack of depth. It means depth without chaos. As this part of the story continues to unfold inside you, you may find yourself reflecting on the message again, not with pain, but with compassion. You understand now that their words weren't meant to reopen the door. They were meant to close it gently, without leaving you in doubt. And that closure has done its work. You no longer feel the need to be remembered by them in a particular way. You no longer need to hold a special place in their heart to validate the connection. You know what you shared was real, and that knowledge doesn't require ongoing confirmation. This is where self-respect becomes embodied. Not as a concept, but as a way of moving through the world. You walk differently now. You listen differently. You choose differently. And those differences may not be obvious to others, but they are unmistakable to you. You are no longer living in reaction to what happened. You are living in response to who you are. This part of the journey also brings a deeper sense of peace with endings. You no longer see them as failures or losses. You see them as transitions, moments where life redirects you towards something more aligned, even if the redirection initially hurts. You trust that now. You trust that what didn't stay was never meant to become the center of your life. You trust that what comes next will not require you to abandon yourself to be loved. You trust that you don't have to suffer to prove the depth of your heart. And that trust allows you to open again, not recklessly, but authentically. As this chapter truly comes to a close, there is no dramatic farewell. There is no final confrontation or sweeping declaration. There is simply a quiet sense of completion. A feeling that something important has been understood and integrated. You are not the same person you were when this story began. You are wiser. You are steadier. You are more deeply rooted in yourself. And because of that, the love that will meet you in the future will recognize you immediately, not because you are familiar, but because you are aligned. That love will not need hindsight to understand your value. It will not need silence to protect itself. It will not need restraint to survive. It will arrive clearly. And when it does, you will understand why this story had to end the way it did. Not with regret. But with growth. Not with longing. But with clarity. Not with a broken heart. But with a heart that knows itself, and is finally free to choose a love that chooses it back, without hesitation, without fear, and without delay. Stay with me. This part is not about moving on in the way people casually talk about it. It's not about being strong or finding someone new. This part is about what happens inside you once the story truly releases its hold, when the ache no longer asks to be solved, when memory no longer demands interpretation, and when your heart finally understands that it doesn't need to carry anything forward to prove that what you felt was real. By now, the silence has changed again. Earlier, silence felt like absence. Then it felt like relief. Now, it feels like space. And space is where life returns. You may notice that your days don't revolve around emotional processing anymore. You wake up without that immediate check-in, without wondering how you feel about them today, without measuring your mood against a memory. You simply wake up. And that normalcy feels almost surprising, like you've stepped into a version of life that was always waiting patiently for you to arrive. This is not forgetting. This is integration. The connection has moved from the front of your emotional life to a quiet place in your inner landscape. It's still there, but it no longer speaks over everything else. It no longer defines the tone of your days. It has become part of your story instead of the lens through which you see everything. And that shift is profound. You begin to realize how much of your emotional identity was wrapped around being in between. In between clarity and hope. In between knowing and waiting. In between holding on and letting go. Living in that in-between space shaped you, but it also exhausted you. Now, that space has closed. Not with force. Not with anger. But with understanding. You may find yourself thinking about them less frequently, not because you're trying to avoid the thought, but because it no longer arises naturally. When it does, it doesn't hijack you. It passes through like a memory that has already done its work. And when you notice this, there might be a moment of surprise. A moment where you ask yourself, is this really it? Is this how it fades? And the answer is yes. This is how meaningful things fade when they've been fully felt and fully understood. They don't collapse. They soften. You also begin to notice something else. Your emotional energy is no longer leaking. Before, even on good days, part of you was tied to an unresolved thread. Now, that energy returns to you. You feel more focused. More present. More available, not to someone specific, but to life itself. You listen more closely when people speak. You feel more grounded in your body. You experience joy without guilt. That guilt you used to carry, guilt for feeling okay, guilt for laughing, guilt for imagining a future without them, begins to dissolve. You realize how unfair that guilt was. How it kept you emotionally loyal to a story that had already ended. You were loyal long enough. This is where your heart stops negotiating with the past. You no longer feel the need to defend what you felt to anyone, not even to yourself. You don't need to justify why it mattered or explain why it hurt. You don't need to frame it as right or wrong. It simply was. And because it was, and because it's complete, you can finally put it down. This is also where your self-image changes in subtle but lasting ways. You stop seeing yourself as someone who loved too much or waited too long. You begin to see yourself as someone who loved honestly, stayed present, and eventually chose self-respect when honesty was not met with action. That reframe is everything. It replaces shame with dignity. It replaces doubt with trust. It replaces self-questioning with self-knowing. You trust yourself now, not just intellectually, but somatically. Your body trusts you. Your nervous system trusts you. There is no longer an internal conflict between what you feel and what you allow yourself to do. This alignment brings a kind of peace that is not dramatic but deeply stabilizing. You also begin to see how this experience refined your emotional intelligence. You can now recognize emotional unavailability without labeling it as mystery. You can sense when someone is present versus when they are simply engaged. You can feel the difference between chemistry and compatibility almost immediately. This doesn't make you rigid. It makes you clear. And clarity is kind. You won't waste someone else's time or your own. You won't linger in situations that ask you to shrink. You won't confuse intensity with intimacy again. That doesn't mean you've lost your softness. In fact, you may notice that you're softer now, less guarded, less reactive, less afraid of feeling deeply. Because you no longer associate depth with pain. You know now that depth only hurts when it isn't met with truth. This is an important distinction. Depth plus silence equals suffering. Depth plus honesty equals intimacy. You lived through the first so you could recognize the second without fear. As this part of the journey settles, you may reflect on how different you feel when you imagine love now. Before, love felt like longing, waiting, and holding space. Now, it feels like presence, steadiness, and mutual choice. You don't imagine convincing someone anymore. You don't imagine proving yourself. You don't imagine enduring confusion. You imagine being met. That shift changes the trajectory of your life in ways you may not fully see yet, but you will feel them. In the way you say no more easily. In the way you say yes more freely. In the way you walk away without needing a dramatic reason. You are no longer afraid of endings. And because of that, you are no longer afraid of beginnings. This is where the heart becomes truly open, not desperate, not guarded, but available. Available to something that doesn't need to be earned through pain. Available to a love that doesn't arrive late with explanations. You may still carry tenderness for what you shared. That tenderness is not a threat to your future. It's evidence of your capacity to care deeply without losing yourself. You don't need to harden to protect yourself anymore. You know how to choose yourself now. And that knowing is quiet, steady, and unshakable. If you listen closely, you may realize that the heartbreak you feared for so long has transformed into something else entirely. It has become wisdom. It has become grounding. It has become a filter that keeps what cannot meet you from staying too long. This part of the story does not end with a lesson written in bold letters. It ends with a feeling of being whole again. Of no longer carrying unfinished business in your chest. Of trusting that what is meant for you will not require silence to survive. You are no longer defined by what ended. You are defined by what you learned to choose. And what you chose, in the end, was yourself. That choice echoes forward into everything that comes next. Stay with me. This last part is not meant to rush you into a conclusion or push you toward a neat ending. It's meant to sit with you like a quiet presence, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you, the kind that simply understands. This is the part where the story no longer feels like something that happened to you, but something that gently shaped you into who you are now. By this point, the heartbreak doesn't announce itself anymore. It doesn't show up as sudden waves or sharp reminders. Instead, it exists as a softened memory, like a scar that no longer hurts when you touch it but reminds you of what you survived. You don't flinch at it. You don't avoid it. You just know it's there, and that it no longer controls you. You may notice something surprising now. You don't feel the need to check in on them, even emotionally. There was a time when you could sense them without trying, when your thoughts would drift toward them automatically, when your heart felt tied to their inner world in a way that was hard to explain. That tether has loosened. Not because the connection was fake, but because its work is done. And that realization is both tender and powerful. You begin to understand that the deepest connections aren't always meant to stay in our lives forever. Some are meant to arrive, awaken something inside us, and then step aside so we can carry that awakening forward on our own. What made this connection painful was not that it ended, it was that it ended without clarity for so long. Now that clarity has arrived, the pain no longer needs to speak. You're no longer trying to figure out what you meant to them. You already know. You meant truth they weren't ready to live. You meant depth they didn't know how to hold. You meant a version of themselves they couldn't stay present with. And that knowledge doesn't inflate your ego or feed longing. It grounds you. It tells you that you were never invisible, never forgettable, never mistaken in what you felt. You were simply ahead of the moment they were capable of meeting. There is a strange peace in understanding that. You also begin to feel compassion for the version of them who couldn't choose differently, not a compassion that excuses, but one that releases. You see how fear shaped their decisions, how comfort disguised itself as responsibility, how silence felt safer than truth. You no longer need them to apologize again or explain more. You understand the pattern well enough to step out of it completely. And stepping out doesn't feel like loss anymore. It feels like freedom. This is where your inner world becomes quieter and more spacious. You have room now for your own thoughts, your own desires, your own sense of direction. You don't feel pulled backward or forward by unfinished emotional threads. You feel rooted in yourself, steady in a way that doesn't depend on anyone else's awareness. That steadiness is new. And it changes how you relate to everything. You listen differently now, not just to others, but to yourself. When something doesn't feel right, you don't rationalize it away. When something feels good, you don't question whether it's allowed. You trust your responses because you've seen what happens when you don't. You also stop confusing intensity with meaning. Before, the strongest emotions often came from uncertainty, from longing, from the tension of not knowing where you stood. Now, you recognize that kind of intensity as a signal, not of destiny, but of imbalance. Real connection, you've learned, doesn't keep you guessing. It doesn't require you to decode silence or wait for courage that may never come. Real connection feels calm. Not boring. Not flat. Calm in the way that your nervous system recognizes safety. This understanding reshapes your expectations without hardening your heart. You're still open. Still capable of deep feeling. But you're no longer willing to stay where openness isn't met with presence. And that is not a loss of romance. It's the evolution of it. You may also notice that your sense of identity has subtly shifted. You no longer define yourself through what happened or who walked away. You don't introduce your story to yourself through heartbreak. You see yourself as someone who went through something profound and came out clearer, stronger, and more aligned. You didn't survive this. You integrated it. That's a huge difference. Survival leaves you braced. Integration leaves you open. You're open now, not in a fragile way, but in a grounded one. You know what you can handle. You know what you won't accept. And you know that walking away from something that cannot grow with you is not failure, it's wisdom. This is also where you stop fearing that the connection was the best it will ever be. That fear used to whisper that nothing else could match the depth, that you had already experienced the peak. Now, you understand that what felt rare was not the person, it was the level of honesty your heart is capable of. And that level didn't disappear when the connection ended. It lives in you. Which means it can be met again, this time by someone who is present, available, and unafraid to choose. You don't need to rush toward that future. You don't need to search for it. You trust now that you'll recognize it when it arrives, because it won't feel like longing. It will feel like alignment. Until then, you are not waiting. You are living. Living in a way that doesn't revolve around emotional absence. Living in a way that honors your time, your energy, your heart. Living with a sense of self that doesn't collapse when something meaningful ends. This is where gratitude quietly replaces grief. Not gratitude for the pain, but gratitude for the clarity it forced. Gratitude for the boundaries it taught you to respect. Gratitude for the strength it revealed in you when you thought you were just trying to hold on. You held on long enough. Now, you hold yourself. And that changes everything. This final part of the story doesn't close with a declaration or a lesson spelled out neatly. It closes with a feeling, one you may already recognize. A feeling of being complete again. Of no longer searching for something outside yourself to explain your worth. Of trusting that whatever comes next will meet you where you are, not where you once waited. You are no longer defined by the last message. You are defined by what you did after reading it. You chose clarity over confusion. You chose self-respect over longing. You chose presence over possibility.
Hello everyone. You are defined by what you did after reading it. You choose clarity over confusion. You choose self respect over longing. You choose presence over possibility, and because of that, your heart is no longer broken. It's whole, quite steady, completely. This chapter is finished not because it stopped mattering, but because it finished slapping you into someone who no longer settles for love that arrives too late, speak too softly, or hides behind fear. What comes next will need a final message to explain itself. It will simply stay. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to this channel and also like this video.